It's
Hey,
it's
Joe.
showtime.
Yeah,
Calling Chris Anderson. Whoa, whoa, whoa!
I
In a new
know, right?
location. Where are you?
It's a new location, and it's not a hotel room. It's kind of be confusing all
I know.
around.
Wait a minute.
I
That's
am,
like what?
I'm at the ye old family homestead here in Norwell, Massachusetts. So I'm visiting the
Wow,
folks for a few days, and the studio is in the dining room.
wow.
I want to show you all the pictures of baby Chris, though.
Oh, please do text them to me.
Uh,
There's a big HHH Facebook post in the waiting there.
but
Uh,
you're still in Chicago.
I am in Chicago for the near future. Yeah.
Um,
So hanging out here in my studio high above Chicago's Michigan Avenue. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. Thank you to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for their assistance in bringing you this show. Check out their rich offering of history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. Today, we'll be talking about the Maginot Line, a new book about that. So, Chris, I just want, before we get into stuff, I wanted to
yeah,
mention that I was a judge yesterday
you
for
were.
National History Day.
Were you like a
So,
hanging judge, or were you like the nice judge?
I was a very kind judge. They said
Okay.
that the number one rule of History Day was don't make the children cry. So
You
I
took
went
that to heart.
I took that to heart, and
Yeah.
this was operated by Chicago Metro History Day. So this was a regional. There were 1,600 kids who took part, a few hundred
Awesome.
judges. It was a crazy Charlie Foxtrot,
Yeah.
and I paired up with another judge, and we judged group exhibits. But it was so cool to see the kid. The kids are so
Yeah.
excited, and for some of them, this is their first time in a competition out of their school. They really they're like they don't even know what's going on,
Yeah.
and so it gives me hope for the future, right?
Well, I'm just happy to see National History Day is still going on. So
Right, since
you're,
their money was
you're to
taken
be
away.
you're to be applauded, Rick. And now, how often do I say that?
Oh my God, I'm gonna
Yes,
go home happy now.
you are
Um,
home.
I am home. Hey, we should also mention that whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening in your car to the HHH podcast,
Oh,
welcome.
okay.
And thanks to all our Patreon supporters, especially our top shelf patrons. You can become one at patreon.com/history happy hour. I'm just such a pitch man. Uh,
Yeah.
let us know what you're drinking, Chris, and tell me what people are drinking or who's out there or something.
Well, I'm drinking Newcastle Nut Brown Ale, and I don't know who's out there because for some reason, since I've crossed the puddle, my little like running scrolling commentary is not present. I just noticed. So
Well,
you have to be
we
okay.
have Liz Mumford, Diane Burnt, Midori Hasagawa, Natasha Bitter, all sorts of people. Some names I recognize, some I don't. Xavier's here,
Good.
Stephen Esty, Todd Barry, David LaGraves, Doreen Schultz is here. Uh, uh, Pat Marriott says, "Get closer to your microphone, Chris." Well, Chris.
I've already gotten that lecture, Pat, and I'll just shout louder.
Yeah,
But
so
it's in London.
we're all doing the best we can here. Um, well, we'll get started, and if we need to, we'll raise your volume, and you can shout, and we'll make it go.
Sure.
So it'll all work
Uh,
out. So give me a cue, and we'll get it underway.
ooh, bars open.
I wasn't sure if the first one came through, so I did it
No,
twice.
it was like a hint, and then it was the
I was
and the
too quick. I was too quick off
um,
the.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Okay.
what's on
No,
tap?
yeah. So this week, we mentioned this earlier. We have a new book coming out about the Maginot Line, the history of the Maginot Line, by Kevin Passmore. And Kevin Passmore is professor of history at Cardiff University. He's the author of Fascism: A Very Short Introduction, The Right in France from the Third Republic to Vichy, and From Liberalism to Fascism: The Right in a French Province, 1928 to 1939. But we're here to talk about the new book, The Maginot Line, The New History, which has been getting really great reviews over here, in England, back home. and Douglas Porch, who, as our viewers know, is one of my history heroes, and who's a veteran of the show, said that Passmore's path-breaking study explores the political, social, and cultural dimensions of interwar French defense policy to determine why the Maginot Line was built, how it was configured, and its role in shaping France's 1940 defeat.
Well, fantastic.
Yes.
Kevin, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Welcome. Thanks very much for inviting me and giving me the chance to speak about the Maginot Line.
Yeah, fantastic. And we should mention that because the time change took place in the U.S. And not in the U.K. Not in the U.K. That we told him the show was going to be at 10 p.m. UK time, and it's actually 8 p.m. UK time. So Kevin didn't get that last 2 hours of preparation. Otherwise, he would have had his tuxedo on, and he would have been, remarkably well more prepared for the interview. But he has answered the call to come here early. We apologize, and we thank you for being part of the show.
He saved our
The only thing I haven't got is a drink.
Oh, no. Well, we thought we gave you enough time to get one of those, but that's okay.
Rick can keep talking, like if you need to go work.
Yeah, we can.
I'll be fine.
Okay.
I'll be fine. I've got to teach tomorrow morning early. So.
Okay.
Okay.
So, Kevin, there's a very famous book by a historian called Mark Bloch, as you know, and he wrote a book called Strange Defeat, which tries to explain the defeat of France in 1940. And I think it's safe to say that that's been an incredibly influential book in how we remember what happened to France. I remember reading it when I was younger because it was one of the only things in English before Horn's books came out. And so he kind of set the stage. And he says, and you mentioned this in your book, Bloch, unwittingly echoed de Gaulle in claiming that the parliamentary regime had allowed too much power to the old-fashioned feudal general staff, which had sunk excessive money in concrete at the expense of tanks and planes. We were taught, he wrote, to place all our confidence in the Maginot Line, built at great expense with a great outpouring of publicity, only to make it too short on the left, thus allowing it to be outflanked. So, what does Bloch get wrong, and why did he need it?
Bloch's book is a great book, and it's great on many aspects of French history, but on the Maginot Line, well, it wasn't exactly the Maginot Line that was outflanked. It was the French armies that entered Belgium that were outflanked and surrounded, as Bloch well knew, because he was one of them, and had to be evacuated from Dunkirk. He was partly responsible for the myth of the Maginot Line, actually, because, in fact, the French plan had always been, the French had always known that the most likely invasion route was through Belgium. And one of the first lines of the first plans for the Maginot Line, the report of 1926, says the easiest invasion route in France is through Belgium. And it pretty much goes without saying that the best French troops will be stationed on the Belgian border. And the plan was always to meet the Germans in Belgium.
Right.
So the Maginot Line was actually built to force the Germans to attack through Belgium. And it was deliberately, the final fort was deliberately sited near Longuyon, because as soon as you tried to outflank it through Longuyon, you had to violate Belgian neutrality. And violating Belgian neutrality meant that the British were certain to intervene. So it was deliberately built to force the Germans to invade through Belgium. And the French plan was always to meet the Germans in Belgium. What went wrong was that they were outmaneuvered in Belgium, a war of maneuver in Belgium that they lost.
So maybe we can, as a context here, maybe we can talk a little bit about where the Maginot Line was. You touched on that, but if we could talk in a little more detail, I'll throw a map up. Where was the Maginot Line, and how substantial a fortification was it really? We've all heard the phrase Maginot Line, but I mean, it's I don't know much about what it's composed of. So maybe
Well,
talk about where it is and what it's composed of.
well, if you put up your little map, I'll explain. The Maginot Line proper is the strong red line there is what was built under the plans of 1930, which is, I suppose, in its strict definition, the Maginot Line, except that it's the arrow pointing into Germany there. So you've got Belgium in the north, then Luxembourg, then Germany. But in fact, it's only on the upper face of that arrow that the strong fortifications were built. The other face of the German border, going northwards past Strasbourg, that's the Rhine. And on there were a number of machine gun casements because they relied largely on the river. Now, on the Maginot Line proper, which goes, as you can see, actually, it's not quite accurate, but it forces you, if you're going to outflank it, you've got to go through Belgium. So even in that, there was one big gap and one small one. So really, it's just two so-called fortified regions along that north face of the hard line. One of them was named after the city of Metz, M-E-T-Z, which is near there, and the other is called Fortified Region of Lauter, which is a river which forms part of that border with Germany. So the Maginot Line the Maginot Line proper is just there. And there it has these huge forts, underground forts, which are on one of my other slides.
Yeah, I'm not so sure which one we should show here.
Well,
But
I think if you show the one with the 3 pictures.
oh, okay. Hang on, this one.
That one, yeah. So on the bottom left, you see the entrance, and you see you should be able to see a railway line going in through the doors there. There was another entrance as well, but this is the main entrance, and through there went stores, supplies, and people. They went in on narrow gauge railways, and inside the forts there were little electric trains. But there, some of the forts you went straight down a lift deep underground, underneath a hill. Other forts you went down a slope down into the bowels of the earth, 30 to 80 meters underground. And down near the entrance were hospital, a power plant, which you can see there. That's diesel generators and so on. In fact, in this case, in a beautiful modernist style black and white photograph. Most military photographs weren't up to that artistic standard, but there's also hospitals, barracks for the troops. These forts could hold anything from 100 to 1,000 men. And then after all these so-called services, the headquarters, the magazines, the hospitals, the galleries, the underground tunnels went on. And if you go back to the triple photograph again, on the right, you can see an aerial view. And each of those yellow marks, if you can see them, is a so-called combat block. So the galleries went down under the hill, and then at certain points, they went up to the surface through a lift. And in those blocks were turrets, as you can see on the top left, or artillery casements, which we saw just in one of the other photographs that we saw just now with the German soldiers lounging on it after camp. So on the surface, you could see virtually nothing. They were all very well disguised. The turrets came out of the ground just to fire. The casements were camouflaged and disguised. As it turned out, the casemates were much more vulnerable, actually, than the turrets were virtually invulnerable, but the casemates, as we shall see possibly later, weren't. So that's what they are. They're individual forts. Contrary to the myth, which survives even in some historical works, the individual forts weren't linked together, but there were about 30 of them on that part of the Maginot Line. Some of them had artillery, some of them just had anti-tank guns and machine guns.
So Kevin, one of the thing that strikes me is the Maginot Line is one of these things that everybody has an opinion on, and they're based on, I think, in part what Bloch has said. I think a lot of people's opinions of the Maginot Line are based on what George C. Scott said of the Patton movie. There are all these assumptions, and I'm reading through the comments on the side there, and a lot of them are sort of the things that people always believe, that well, the French, they sat in fixed fortifications, and the Germans just ran circles around them, and all those sort of things that people assume. So in your book, of course, you're diving into this, but you say that one story of the Maginot Line was that the French had learned the wrong lessons of the Great War, or one of the assumptions people make is that.
Yeah.
So what were the lessons, and kind of use that as a jumping off point for maybe like the origin of the idea of even building this thing?
Well, one of the things, I have a chapter on the lessons of the Great War, as you know,
Right.
and I begin and end it with two different quotations. There are many other quotations, where generals would say, well, everybody talks about the lessons of the war, but nobody agrees what they are. And as far as fortifications goes, there were different lessons, at least three major ones. One was that you had maneuver, and there was a whole lobby in the French army led by Marshal Foch, and then later by General Weygand, who was head of the army in the early 1930s. They said maneuver is what matters. Fortification only matters as long as it supports maneuver. And that was actually the conception that largely dominated the Maginot Line. We'll secure the German border so that we reserve our best troops to go into Belgium. Another lesson was that trenches were the only way to defend, trenches were the way to defend yourself. And that's what Marshal Pétain, who became, of course, the head of the Vichy regime and ended up being sentenced to death for collaboration during the Second World War, but he advocated what's known as defense in depth, echelon defense, where successive layers, successive rows of field fortifications. And the idea was that the attackers would exhaust themselves in taking one line of trenches after another, because they would have to bring up their artillery and begin a new preparation and so on. They would gradually be worn down, and then Pétain said you would counterattack. But there was also another method, which was basically modeled on, or at least a version of the Battle of Verdun, because the French had fixed fortifications in World War I as well. Verdun, which is very famous, a huge complex of forts that was part of the whole system along the whole frontier. But they were fixed permanent fortifications, which during the war were modernized, and they also provided a potential model. And the thinking behind some of those people who advocated this was that you could actually seal the frontier itself. You could stop the Germans getting into France at all. Whereas Pétain's method, you would let them, through these echelon defenses, get into the country. And he positioned his echelon defenses a long, long way back, actually. So, 50, 60 kilometers into France. So people accused him of losing parts of the territory and so on. So there were lots of debates about what to build, where to build them, whether whether the future war would be a war of attrition, or whether the future war would be a war of movement. And as I described the French plan just now, the French arguably lost, not because they sat behind their fortifications, but because they advanced too far into Belgium and allowed themselves to be surrounded.
Right.
So, again, sort of looking for some context here. We refer glibly to the Maginot Line. So, who was Maginot?
Well,
Who was Maginot? And also, when did it become known as the Maginot Line? So, the two questions in one.
Well, it's a kind of interesting anecdote, because Maginot was a member of Parliament, but like many members of French Parliament, he fought in the First World War. He was seriously wounded in the first month. If you know the history of the First World War, the first month, August, September, was a war of maneuver. and he was involved in that. And new tactics developed very quickly, and he was involved, in fact, in a raiding group, patrolling and raiding group, which nobody had foreseen that they would be necessary, but he made one. He was a sergeant, despite being a member of parliament. But he was wounded very quickly. He continued his political career during the war. He was war minister just after the First World War in the very early 1920s. But then for a long time, he was out of power. And whilst he was out of power, what became known as the Maginot Line was planned, but somebody else, a left-wing member of parliament called Paul Passmore, who's now forgotten, he planned it. But his government, the government he was in, fell just as the law was about to come to parliament. So it was Maginot that presented it to parliament. But when it was presented, and in all the press releases afterwards, Maginot quite generously said, well, all I've done is bring to parliament the work of my predecessor, Paul Passmore. But then, in subsequent years, a debate developed between left and right. Maginot was on the right, Passmore was on the left, about who was responsible. And they argued about it. But then, in 1937, the film adaptation of a book appeared called Double Crime on the Maginot Line. And it was written by a serving military officer, anonymously, and he happened to be very right-wing. And so he called it the Maginot Line. And as a result, it's a long story, but as a result, almost accidentally, sometime after Maginot was dead, that took root in popular culture because the film was seen by millions of people.
And it was a crime novel, right? It was a murder mystery.
Absolutely. It was a crime novel. It was an Agatha Christie type crime novel because if you know, Agatha Christie novels have to take place in an enclosed space. You know, like a Nile cruiser or
a train, right?
Or a train or something. And so the Maginot Line suited perfectly because everybody's in there. They can barely get out. And so you have to find the solution within this, you know, a locked room mystery, if you like. So the Maginot Line suited perfectly because the author of it, Nord, who was an army officer, he'd happened to visit it during his training. So he thought, and he was interested in crime novels. So he thought this is a great setting. And he knew the genre really well.
So Kevin, I mean, you know, again, there's so much fascinating detail in the book, and I was really struck by a lot of the stuff in the beginning because, again, I made assumptions too. I assumed that, you know, people higher in the French administration, and I originally thought Maginot was one of them, said there's a threat from Germany. We're going to protect France, so we're all going to build this great big wall, and everybody agrees on it. And we build it, and it becomes what it is. But as you get into, that's very far from the case. So maybe you could talk about sort of the genesis of the idea and where this comes from, because what strikes me is when France decides to commit to this effort, a third of their country is still in ruins from the First World War. They're still trying to get over all of that. And somebody says, well, so a little bit about sort of the genesis of the idea. And then the other thing that's so fascinating is the effects that politics have on design and implementation. Like, it looks like it does because of things that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that your assumptions, I think, aren't completely wrong at all. Actually, there were people who thought, as you said, that especially in the later 1930s, but not initially, that we must retreat behind our frontier and not be involved. They were the equivalent of isolationists, I guess. They were appeasers. They said, you know, Germany poses no threat to us. We must, and they did say, we must retreat behind our fortifications, but also into the empire. So that wasn't untrue. But there were other people, anti-appeasers, there were plenty of anti-appeasers, said, you know, we must be willing to risk war. So France was divided, I think is the truth. But after the First World War, Fortification was discussed after the First World War, but so was every other aspect of the war. In 1919-21, there are long reports on everything: air warfare, tanks, engineering, all sorts of stuff, everything. They had this huge inquiry into the war. So fortification was only one aspect. But fortification was not initially a priority for the simple reason that the policy of the French government up until 1924 was to occupy and weaken Germany. The French occupied part of Germany until 1930. Even after that, part of Germany was demilitarized. The Germans weren't allowed to station troops there. In 1923-4, the French occupied the Ruhr in order to try and force the Germans to pay reparations. And so their aim at that point was to fight not only in Belgium, but when they talked about fortifications, they were going to build them in their occupied zone in Germany. So until 1924, that was the policy. But the French found that the British and the Americans did not want to take a hard line against Germany. They wanted to reintegrate Germany into the world economy, and basically the French turned to a policy, therefore, in the later 1920s of reconciliation with Germany. And as part of reconciliation, they basically agreed the equivalent of what we in the 90s would have seen as 80s would have seen as nuclear arms control, that they outlawed offensive weapons. And so they focused on fortifications, so the Germans weren't allowed to build any. At that point, that's the point at which they built the Maginot Line. But even then, the plan, as I said earlier, was if the Germans do invade, we will meet them in Belgium and in the demilitarized zone, which they still had up until 1935. We will meet them there. The plan was always, the basic principle was, we'll seal the German, and we haven't mentioned the Italian border, because the Italians were a threat too, so that we reserve our best troops to fight the Germans in Belgium.
Yeah.
So the wall is started in about 1930, right?
Yeah, that's when they seriously started building it.
Right. And it's under construction, I mean, in some ways, all the way up till 1940, but basically for the next 5 years, it's under major construction. Yeah. So as it is being built and it comes into existence, does the very fact that it now exists start to influence French strategy or politics?
I think it absolutely does. And whilst I say that many of the myths about the Maginot Line are wrong, it did become a weight on French strategy. I think it's important to remember that the French, like the British, were massively overstretched. They had huge imperial commitments from the Far East to North Africa. Money was short. Not a lot of money was spent on the Maginot Line after 1935. But it became a huge bureaucracy, and it became very greedy in men. And they created a huge number, I forget the exact number, of fortification regiments, which immobilized a part of the army and reduced the part of the army that was available for maneuver. And it became an interest group in the army. It protected its interests. It resisted reform. There were plans to... So the great problem with the Maginot Line was it wasn't the cost, but that it never economized on manpower. And it was an interest group. And so whilst after 1935, the French spent a huge amount of money, far, far more than they ever did on the Maginot Line, on tanks and planes, the Maginot Line was still a drag. And Foch had said at the beginning, if you build it, you're going to have to defend it. And to a considerable extent, that turned out to be true. And maneuvering, but so the story's two-sided, I think.
Well, just to understand that, and Chris, pardon me for jumping in, but how many what's a rough number? And I know it probably depends on whether they've mobilized or not, but how many people are defending the Maginot Line?
Well, when on mobilization, the French mobilized, I think, something like 3.5 to 4 million men, which is a lot of people. Almost every male under the age of 48 initially. 2 million of them were frontline troops, but believe it or not, about half of them at any one time were stationed on the Maginot Line.
Wow.
Which shows, and the problem was when the Germans broke through, the French had no reserves or insufficient reserves to counterattack. There were two reasons. One, there were too many people behind the Maginot Line. And the other reason is that they'd sent their best armoured divisions right into an attempt actually to outflank the Germans themselves in the Netherlands.
I think we have a map of that, right?
Yeah. If you can see that map, you'll see that in roughly the middle where it says Ardennes, that's where the Maginot Line ends, and the French were going to remain stationary there, right up and a bit further northwards as well. They expected the Germans to attack in northern and central Belgium, and that's where they planned to send their troops. And you can see that that's what they did. The problem was that the Germans dummied an attack in the north, and they actually attacked further south through the Ardennes there, absolutely, and surrounded the Allied armies in Belgium. They were stuck. They had actually they basically parried the German attacks there. They arguably won the armoured battles there. There were massive armoured battles, which they won. But of course, they were cut off. They were surrounded, and the British and French had to evacuate from Dunkirk. Most of them, I think 50,000 British were left behind, something like that, and quite a few more than that of French. And so that's what happened. Effectively, the battle was, the French knew that they were defeated, arguably, by the 15th of May. That's within 5 days of the German invasion. I mean, the archives show that in their private conversations, they knew that all was lost.
Mm.
Well, yeah, one of the things, you're kind of getting back to the stockpile manpower, but again, it just absolutely fascinates me. They're building this stretch of fortification. They don't have the manpower to actually to build it, and they're hiring Germans to work on the construction sites.
But they did hire Germans. They did hire Germans. I mean, you have to remember Alsace-Lorraine, where it was built in Alsace and Lorraine, which is an area which the Germans had taken from the France in 1870. The French got it back in 1918. And the Germans had taken it because it was German speaking, but the population largely favoured France. They said, we may speak German dialects and we know the German language from school, but nevertheless, we consider ourselves French. So the Germans took it on those grounds. But there was always a lot of cross-border relations there, as there are now. Yeah, it's probably the only part of the world where you can switch between French and German and people will understand.
I had to, kind of add to the conversation, and I was going to ask this later, but we've walked into this, and it's important. Again, I didn't really realize. I had always assumed one of the casus belli of the First World War are the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, and there's all this film footage of the maidens waving in their costumes, and France is overjoyed that they're back. But as you described in the book, they hate the Alsatians, and the Alsatians hate them. And
well, yeah.
So I think maybe kind of explains, because nobody other than professors of French history are even aware of this. You and the Alsatians and the French, but like to most readers, they think it's just part of France. But this is a major part of your story.
It's to be honest, actually, this is one of the original parts of the book, is that I think that nobody had realized how many of the troops who manned the Maginot Line were actually German speakers. And if they were reserves, the older they were, the less likely they were to speak any French, because younger people had been to school. They were supposed to learn French in school, but they didn't have a teacher.
Some of them had served in the German army in the First World War.
Well, absolutely, many of them had served in the German army. Many of them had served in the German army.
Oh.
So, and I tell the story in the final chapter. I tell the story of a captain who had served in the German army, but he considered himself patriotically French, actually. But the French faced a great problem. Is they thought because these people speak German, they must be loyal to Germany, because nobody had taught them in school that the Alsatians spoke German.
Right.
They said, they're all desperate to come back to France, but they didn't point out that, and there's lots of stuff in the archives. People, colonels and so on, say, well, my troops are totally shocked so that everybody here speaks German. And so, but the French army and the government did think, well, if they speak German, they're potentially loyal to Germany, which was largely untrue, actually. They considered they were mostly Catholic. They considered Germany a Protestant, Protestant oppressors of the Catholic Church, and there were the Lutherans in the north were more pro-German, but even they not necessarily. But nevertheless, the army thought that they were spies. But the problem was that they needed the Germans to man the Maginot Line, because the Germans after 1935 were right on the border. They remilitarized the Rhineland, and they had troops right on the border. So in the event of war, the Maginot Line needed to be reinforced absolutely immediately. And that meant that it was essential to have reserves, people who'd done their military service but were called up again to fight. They had to come from no more than 10 kilometers away. And that meant German speakers. If you get I've got a little map showing the language line there, which
Hang on.
I'd like to see actually, because it dramatizes it there. You can see that is the bit of the border that points into Germany, and you can see the solid lines of the Maginot Line proper. If you can see it, the dotted lines are the light fortifications. Further out, the darkest borders are the borders of the equivalent of the states, so the French departments, so it's Alsace and Lorraine and the Moselle, different parts of the area. But running through the middle of it is the so-called language line. To the west of it, people spoke mostly French. To the right of it, people spoke mostly German. So you can see that the fortifications are located smack bang in the German-speaking zone. And more interesting still is that I've put some grey dots on there, and there was a minority of people in Alsace-Lorraine who were pro-Nazi, and they belonged to a pro-Nazi organization. And there, I have mapped their presence. So right in the vicinity of the Maginot Line, there were quite a strong minority amongst the population who were sympathetic to Nazi Germany. And they belong to pro-Nazi organizations. So that's one of the original parts of the book.
That's fascinating.
So we're talking about the Alsace-Lorrainers, but I'm also curious, what did the Germans think about this wall, right? This wall is going up, and it starts before Hitler comes into power, and it's still being constructed as Hitler is coming into power and reoccupying the Rhineland and such. So what is the German point of view? Are they frightened of it? Are they dismissive of it? Is it something else? Where do they stand?
No, they absolutely took it seriously. They concluded in their studies of it that they could not attack it until 1941 or 1942. The Germans built fortifications of their own, which people may have heard of, the Siegfried
West
Line,
Wall.
the West Wall, and they had exactly the same thinking. They wanted to secure their border with France so that they could attack Poland and Austria and Czechoslovakia. basically. So there again, it was to economize troops, but the Germans did economize troops. They put very poorly trained second-rate soldiers on there, whereas the French soldiers on the Maginot Line were highly trained and very well equipped. So the Germans built fortifications themselves, but they thought it was very strong, and they did exactly what the French hoped we would do. They concluded that they couldn't attack the Maginot Line and that therefore they must attack through Belgium, which is exactly what the French hoped to persuade them to do. So in a sense, the Maginot Line worked, but as we said earlier, in another sense, it didn't.
Right. Well, I want to start talking about the war, but one last final question is kind of in this the prequel to this. Let's just ask about what do the Germans think. What do the French people think? What do they know about this? And again, one of the stories you hear is the French people were convinced, well, we have this wall protecting us so that we don't have to think about this anymore.
No.
What were the French people really thinking about?
Well, it's difficult to know what the average person was thinking. You can only go by what was in the newspapers. And the French press, for example, I've looked through all of that. The left-wing press virtually never mentioned anything to do with military hardware or military tactics. To be honest, they were pretty ignorant of it. The Communist Party sometimes mentioned military hardware, but Russian, Soviet hardware. And they said, this is the real thing. So the left largely weren't interested at all. The right did discuss it often, but they were just as likely, and in fact, with time, more likely to mention tanks and aircraft, actually. So they got mixed messages from the press. There was very little actual reporting on the Maginot Line, and that was simply because the army was so worried about spying that they wouldn't let the press near it. And even most of the photographs that did appear were actually in old German fortifications that had been captured from the Germans after the First World War, in Alsace, in fact. So there's virtually it's only in late 1938 that the Maginot Line became part of publicity. And that was actually in response to a German press campaign to publicize the Westfall. And they had a massive press campaign. They invited the press of the world to visit it, to show how strong they were, in order to persuade people not to attack Germany whilst they, got on with their business on their eastern frontier. So the messages were mixed. What I would say about the eve of the war, which is really important, is that public opinion was quite divided. By then, the first opinion polls had happened in France, and most people were in favour of going to war, actually. But there was a lobby that was against. They were a minority by 1939. Appeasement for various reasons had gone out of fashion. But there was a minority that did want to, sit behind the fortifications and extend them to the north, even though it was really difficult to fortify the north. And even the arch-appeasers who really didn't want to go to war, even they admitted, well, if the Germans attack in Belgium, we've got to meet them there. The question
the Germans attack in Belgium, but famously, they attack where it's not really expected, which is through Ardennes, which is in southern Belgium. And I've always wondered about this. Are the French really defenseless here, or is the German army just so much better than them, or what is going on here that this attack, is it just that they're not expecting it and they're just completely knocked off their bearings? I mean, what's going on here?
Well, they did think an attack through the Ardennes forest, where that big arrow is, was possible. And they had, one of the commanders had a war game and said that they could reach that point in 3 days. What people did take them by surprise was the fact that they immediately crossed the Meuse River. Because they didn't wait for their artillery, because they used their Stuka dive bombers for artillery preparation. And the background to that is that the French adopted, because nobody's ever come up with an alternative to this, is that they adopted the strategy of initial defense, which meant that they had very long lines, whereas the Germans were able to choose their point of attack, and they were able to concentrate absolutely overwhelming force on the weakest point in the French line. The French thought that they would have time to bring up reserves, but of course they didn't have time because the Germans crossed so quickly. And in any case, partly thanks to the Maginot Line, they didn't have many reserves. And also because if you look at the top arrow, you see that white arrow goes right up to Breda in the Netherlands, Holland. So that was meant to be their strategic reserve. If it had been there, it was a very, very good light armored division and some motorized infantry. If they'd been there and able to counterattack in the Ardennes, it would have undoubtedly, we can't say that the French would have won, but it would have been a different story.
So
I think Kevin, it was a disadvantage.
So Kevin, you've mentioned this, and I think just our viewers would probably benefit.
Where our readers? What?
All right, I tell you. What time is it in England, Rich?
I don't know. We're
It's
going on
on.
that, are we? Okay.
All
It's
right.
war. Fine. I'm sorry, Chris. We're having some technical difficulty. Okay.
I was back.
So, what exactly is the Dial Breda plan, and why is that sort of the pivotal moment of the campaign as you lay out in the book?
The great debate, the debate amongst the French was not whether to go into Belgium, but how far. And there was a big struggle amongst the high command about this. Some people wanted to just go a few miles over the border to defend the big cities of Lille and Roubaix in the northeast. In the northeast there. Some people wanted to go the line that kind of goes down in the middle from the Ardennes up towards Holland. That's the so-called Dial Line, named after a river. That was further in, and it allowed the French and the Belgians to save more of the country, hopefully. There was a struggle. The French commander Gamelin was ambitious, and he always wanted fortification to serve as a base for maneuver. So we thought, well, if we neutralize the frontier there, we can go further. And he was at the origin of this so-called variant, the Breda variant, which pushed these armored forces right into the Netherlands. That's I forget the exact distance, but they had to go twice as far, as you can see there, as the Germans to reach that destination. And so it turned out to be a disaster. The Dutch couldn't hold out. They had a very weak army. So the French they retreated within a couple of days back into Belgium. And so the best French armored divisions, they had other armored divisions, were also very good, but they were completely disorganized by this maneuver and found it difficult to play a serious part in the battle.
So go ahead.
Go on.
So, yeah, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I didn't have anything else to say, I don't think.
Okay. So the Germans come through. There's fighting up in northern Belgium. The Germans come through through the Ardennes. They split off the northern troops, who eventually that results in Dunkirk, and then in the south they eventually are going to attack towards Paris, and the French eventually surrender. But is there what fighting actually takes place at the Maginot Line? Because that's one of the things that I was surprised at, is that there is some fighting there, and I wasn't really aware of that.
No, well, I say one of the reasons that makes the Maginot Line worth studying is that arguably, in terms of numbers of soldiers who were captured, it's the second biggest encirclement of the whole Second World War after Kiev. The what happened was that in the second phase of the battle, after Dunkirk, the Allied armies had been evacuated at Dunkirk, and the British disappeared. The French formed new lines from the Channel linking up with the Maginot Line, but they were very weak. The Germans broke through, they headed south, and basically they surrounded Alsace-Lorraine. And they also broke through a gap in the Maginot Line because there was a gap in it, a weak point. They also crossed the Rhine, and so the Maginot Line troops were surrounded from all sides. The great fortifications that we saw, they were surrounded. The troops, about 22 or 25,000 troops, were in those forts. Some of them were captured. Some of them were captured in one particularly tragic case. Most of them held out because the Germans focused on the weaker forts that were armed only with machine guns. Ultimately, the fortifications were surrounded. They only surrendered after the armistice, in fact. But the troops who'd been defending the so-called intervals between the forts, they retreated basically into the hills in the middle of Alsace, the Vosges, and they were surrounded and cut up and picked off piecemeal. And they had mostly surrendered before the armistice came into force on the 25th of June. But the Maginot Line forts were still, most of them were still surrounded but not taken at the armistice, and they refused to surrender. And there's a kind of myth that they were the first resistors, but they didn't contest the armistice. They thought, well, if we don't surrender, we won't be considered prisoners of war. We'll be allowed to march off home. Because France, as a result of the armistice, France was split into an occupied and an unoccupied zone, and they thought that they would be allowed to go off to their homes, either in the occupied or unoccupied zone.
So, I mentioned Bloch's book at the beginning of the show. You go into some fascinating detail about de Gaulle and sort of his wartime writings versus his post-war writings, and that's fascinating and worth a read. But in the aftermath of all of this, going up to the present day, why did the Maginot Line kind of come to quote unquote symbolize what was wrong with France, if you can say that, in 1940? Why does the Maginot Line become, I guess, the excuse or the villain or
Well, it's basically because the leader of the French resistance, who became the leader, General Charles de Gaulle, who led the resistance and then ultimately became president of France in the 1960s, he had made his name as an advocate of the strategic use of armored divisions. And so the resistance was responsible for the Maginot Line myth. They say, look at de Gaulle's modernity, his belief in armored warfare, and they contrasted that with what they called the outdated thinking of Pétain and the fortifiers, if you like. So in the 1960s, the Gaullist state TV, because TV was heavily controlled by the Gaullist regime, they put out documentaries showing that, making de Gaulle the hero. And one aspect of this was his farsightedness, that he'd foreseen the Blitzkrieg. Ironically, what the people didn't know was that de Gaulle had ordered the Maginot Line to be put back in action.
I know. I saw someplace that it was still being used until 1969.
Yeah, well, beyond that, there were it was used as NATO command centers. The French reconditioned and modernized a lot of the forts after the Second World War, but then they started fighting in Algeria, so they didn't have enough money. But they used them as nuclear command centers to store nuclear warheads. And right into the 60s, even after the French withdrew from NATO for many years, the Maginot Line did figure in French war plans in the 60s and 70s. And the Americans attacked the Maginot Line in 1945, and they found the turrets almost impossible to silence,
Huh.
and weapons had moved on by then.
And now it's just a place that Chris can bring his groups and somebody wanted to know. Last question, not a big question. The big questions are done. So, was it as musty for the soldiers who were stationed there as it is for people who visit now?
It depends which one you go to, but it was horribly damp. There were puddles on the floors. The galleries leaked because the underground springs leaked into them. They had a terrible problem with condensation. Food and mattresses rotted. They put in air conditioning, which improved things a bit, but it was not pleasant to live in them.
I'm going to take that as a yes. It was just as bad as it is today.
But if you visit it now, if you look at the bits that are properly concreted, they're not too bad. But once you go into the bits that have only got masonry, then they're not very nice. And a lot of them are now you can't get in them because they've fallen apart.
Kevin Passmore, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much. Talk about your very detailed book, which is called The Maginot Line, A New History. And lots of detail in there, lots of stories, lots of interwar French politics. So thank you so much for joining us today to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for having me and for your great questions.
And you're going to get to bed way earlier than you thought you were. So.
I've still got to eat.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Okay. So, Chris, next week we're in encore mode now for a few weeks.
I'm in go get some sunshine in a tan mode.
Oh yeah. Well, okay, fine. You're headed off to the South Pacific.
I am.
And I'm sure that you'll be sunning yourself. Do you have one of those like tiny little bathing suits, like a bikini bottom type bathing suit?
As the French defenders of the Maginot Line would say, no.
Okay.
But I have a big Panama hat.
All right. So next week we have an encore episode with our fellow Ambrose historian, Jonathan Carroll, on his book, Beyond Black Hawk Down. So this is about the insurgency in Somalia in the 1990s. It was a very interesting episode. And so if you didn't see it, worth checking out. If you did see it, you might want to check it out again and listen to Jonathan's very amenable brogue there. So thank you so much for joining us today. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.